There we go. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm very excited to be able to talk about our open access policy refresh and the launch of VeriXiv. First, I'm going to start off kind of talking about why we are making this change and what we've learned along the way of a decade of open access. So, in 2015, when we launched our original open access policy, it was very much if there's a paid open access option, that would be considered a compliant journal. At the time, that meant that there were a good number of journals that had no open access options. Um, so we, kind of worked through those pain points. One of the, I think, threads throughout all of our work in open access has been the journals needed to have publications for career advancement, and that's an element that I think is a remaining obstacle within achieving open access as the norm. We then shifted in 2021. We joined Coalition S. We implemented Plan S. It was a very interesting time in which to make a policy shift during a pandemic. But I think one thing about the pandemic is it really showed the need for information to flow more openly and freely, and to really focus on collaboration and research instead of competitiveness. And we launched Gates Open Research before that, which I think was one of our first kind of successful introductions of more of a publish, review, and curate model. And it's one of my favorite projects to work on. I think it's what academic publishing could really look like if we leverage technologies and different ways of managing the publication and peer-reviewed process. Throughout, those policy iterations, we've seen kind of our open access compliance steadily rise, but has kind of flattened. Publishers often can be slow to change or have pushed back on change. We were one of the funders that originally launched, say, the rights retention strategy, so allowing for different versions of the article to be made open access. We've supported article processing charges, and unfortunately, we've seen kind of that become the predominant business model, and it's been hard for other models to grow or gain adoption or to shift away from there. The most expensive APC that we currently pay is $12,000 per article. And while we definitely know that there are costs associated to publishing, I think we can all agree that that is too too high of a cost for a single article to be made open access. We've learned and listened a lot from the external community that something needs to change around APCs, and we need to find a model that's much more sustainable and equitable. In general, we've been tracking data over the decade of our open access spend, and we've seen over the years we're asked less and less to pick up the invoice or bill, but we're paying more and more every year. We actually last year paid for only 43% of all the articles published that attributed Gates Foundation funding, so there were other mechanisms that more than 50% achieved open access that way. Not going to talk much about open data availability, but that is very important to the foundation. It's been probably the hardest part of our policy to really enact, is ensuring that all the articles have the underlying data available, especially if journals aren't requiring that. It can be hard for grantee authors at that point to make that data available, but it's something that we've been trying to improve over the years. And of course, we think collective action is very important, and we've worked with a lot of other funders over the past decade to help accelerate that change. And we're really excited to see where we go in the future, especially as the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, the Nelson Memo, comes into effect in the next few years. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to go back. Okay. Okay, so that's a decade of open access. So where are we headed? We definitely recognize that, together in this ecosystem, we've made tangible change. It's been slow, but it is happening. But we recognize that a journey towards more equity in knowledge remains unfinished. And so as part of our mission as an organization in promoting equity for people around the world, we must work towards a more inclusive future in research dissemination. And I really like this is our vision is to really foster a publishing ecosystem that's equitable and inclusive. I think our policy shift in 2025 is a really important one to start us on that journey. I don't think it's the end all be all of an open access policy, but an important shift to kind of get us out of the rut that we're currently in. So we're going to roll out a refreshed open access policy that focuses on addressing equitable practices in scholarly publishing and really aims to drive broader change in the field. We want to inspire a cultural shift away from prestige and privilege in publishing, and one that really does champion equity and access above all. So how do we think we can begin to do that? So, we've talked about in the last decade, we have different, focus points of what needs to be made open access. Is it the journal version of record? Is it, the author accepted manuscript? And now we're moving forward with requiring that a preprint is posted, and that's one version of the manuscript that I think authors still have full control over. And we've seen the success of preprints improve and rise over the years. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And along with that, since preprint servers are free to read, free to publish, free to for the authors and readers, we are making a shift in discontinuing our support for article processing charges. I'm trying to be intentional in the per article payment basis. We want to get away from that. And then we hope as we stop supporting those that we'll be able to then find new open access business models and infrastructure. And the idea is really being able to use our funding to support infrastructure or organizations and groups in the ecosystem that benefit all researchers and not just researchers that are privileged enough to be funded by the Gates Foundation. And some of those models might include, there's Diamond Open Access is starting to really take off. I'm a huge proponent for the subscribe to open model, and just seeing how we can support other models more broadly that aren't focused on that per article basis. So what are preprints? So preprints are early versions of research that are made accessible upon submission. They've yet to undergo a formal peer review, but they allow for broad and early community feedback, and we are supporting several groups that really promote early review and engagement with preprints. And one of the things that I think is often most important to the foundation is that bypassing of the lengthy publishing times and making sure that research is out there and is quickly available. And it's something that we saw as a really important need during the pandemic, and there are many other issues that we are tackling here at the foundation that require such urgency. And we want them to be posted with a CC BY license, so that means that there can be broad reuse of the research. And why do they matter? Again, they're allowing for researchers to be kind of in control of that open and rapid sharing at no cost to them. It enables researchers to cite and quickly build upon research. We've seen, some funders change what can be cited in funding proposals, and I think this is also important from equity standpoint of early career researchers being able to kind of build up their impact in research much more quickly. It's very equitable as far as I think it's really important that preprint servers are often, they're journal agnostic. So we're looking at the merit of the research itself and not what it's published in. So what are the top 5 facts for the open access policy update? All grantees will be affected by the 2025 policy update. So we've had a publication clause in all grant agreements since then. Compliance is mandatory, and we do follow up with non-compliance, but I like to approach it from very much an educational standpoint. We use OA Works and OA Report, which is a great nonprofit tool that helps us to be able to find articles that are behind paywalls, and we like to follow up and give the options of uploading the author accepted manuscripts. So we find ways to make it very easy to be able to correct any non-compliance, and we really want grantees to be excited to share their work openly. We've also been really reinforcing that grantee authors should retain their copyright when publishing, and that allows for broader reuse. There's really no reason to sign copyright over to a publisher. No article processing charges will be supported for submissions after the policy comes live January 1st, 2025. So we will cover submissions that are made during this calendar year, 2024. And understanding that it can often take a long time for articles to get accepted. And yeah, so we have kind of a timeline of transition there, and understanding that'll take time. We also know that that's going to most negatively impact fully open access publishers or grantees without other funding sources. And so we are working through kind of what that looked like, what our recommendations are, and creating guidance that we are providing grantee authors to navigate this change. And we really, trying to make sure that, the policy doesn't impact where and when grantees can publish the research. We like to have this kind of run in parallel. So we know that there's a preprint and we have that information openly available out there. And then, we understand that the traditional publishing process is still of value for career advancement. And dissemination of the research, so hoping that they can happen in parallel. And I will stop there.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Ashley, for setting us up for what's going to follow. We'll be talking about the VeriXiv, the verified preprint server that we produced in collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Before I get onto that, I'd like to see if I can post a poll. If you want. So before we talk about VeriXiv, I'd be interested to know whether you've used a preprint to share your research before. So I'm just going to launch that poll. If you wouldn't mind posting your answers. So often, sometimes, rarely, or never. We'll see what comes through. Interesting. It's like a kind of horse race to see which one comes out top. But looks like so far most of you have never posted a preprint, but kind of quite a mix actually. All right, looks like we've leveled off at 91, 92 posts here. So maybe I'll give it a full minute. That's great. Okay, so that's interesting. Again, we've got quite a wide mix there. Most of you haven't, but a good proportion of you have posted it, either sometimes, rarely, or often. So yeah, it'll be interesting. I think and there'll be some elements of this which will be interesting to all of you, depending on whether you've posted in preprint server or not before. So I'm going to end that poll. Just go back to my slides. Okay, so in this presentation, this part of our webinar, I'm going to describe to you what VeriXiv is, how it's going to work, what's unique about this preprint server versus other preprint servers. We'll be talking a bit about integrity checks and badging, which will be one of the core components of this server. And there'll be, as I say, a comparison towards the end between the sorts of checks that we'll be carrying out and the kinds of checks that are carried out elsewhere, as well as a summary of the many benefits, really, of engaging with this preprint server for Gates grantees. So I'll go straight into the next part. So to give you a brief introduction to VeriXiv, as you will have guessed already from the way we've set this up, VeriXiv's been launched to support researchers to comply with the Gates Foundation's refresh policy, which Ashley's just introduced. And this platform is this server is going to be what we call a verified preprint server, which will be launched in August 2024. so next month. It will have a number of unique features, which I'm going to come on to. But perhaps most important of all, VeriXiv will conduct a series of rigorous pre-publication checks to support greater research integrity. So this will include things like, well, at least 20 compulsory checks to address originality concerns, image manipulation, author verification, and competing interests. If a preprint passes these mandatory checks, it will be published as a verified preprint. In addition to this, the platform will also conduct checks for compliance with things like fair data standards, so checking that data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, along with clear descriptions of methods to support reproducibility. If a preprint passes these checks, it will be published as an open research preprint. Each preprint will have clear labeling so that readers know which checks have been conducted on the article and which checks have been passed. And VeriXiv has really been designed like this from the ground up to raise the publication standards of preprints and ensure their legitimacy as a component of the scholarly record, again, in alignment with the motivations of the policy refresh. So on this slide, I'd like to talk a bit about the workflow for VeriXiv. And for those of you who've published via Gates Open Research before, you'll see this isn't very different if you're familiar with this model, but if you're not, I'll take you through it, and I'll highlight some core differences as well. So essentially, it begins with the publication of your preprint on VeriXiv, followed by optional post-publication review, then post-review publication in a version of record outlet. For now, this will be Gates Open Research is the linked platform that you can publish in if you want to go all the way to the end of that process. Unlike Gates Open Research, this gives authors more options at different stages of the process, rather than offering only one end-to-end route to publication in a final outlet like Gates Open Research. So in this sense, like Ashley described, we're operating a publish, review, curate model. So 3 distinct stages that authors have the option to engage with to openly disseminate their research. I'll take you through the publication part now. So that will begin obviously with submission of your preprint via a single page submission system with ORCID integration. So your ORCID ID will be part of that submission process to validate your author ID. And then a series of pre-publication checks will be carried out on your preprint to ensure that ethical research and publishing guidelines have been adhered to. There'll be some correspondence with you there if there are any questions. So you'll enter into a bit of a dialogue with our editorial team if there's anything that needs to be clarified as part of that process. And then once your preprint has passed those checks, a fully typeset version will be published with a DOI and eventually with badges to signify the checks that your preprint has undergone and passed, which I'm going to come back to later. So unlike preprint servers that only host the PDF and some basic metadata, if your preprint is published on VeriXiv, it will be available in full XML and will be discovered, viewed, and cited on that server. It will also be indexed automatically in Google Scholar. So after your preprint's been published on VeriXiv, you'll then have a choice. So you can either leave your unreviewed preprint on VeriXiv and submit it for review and publication elsewhere, or you can progress to open peer review on VeriXiv with the intention of having your article accepted for final publication on Gates Open Research, which will be the first partner platform of VeriXiv. If you don't decide to go down this optional route involving peer review on VeriXiv, publication on Gates Open Research, then expert reviewers will be selected and invited by our editorial team, and their reviews and names will be published alongside your VeriXiv preprint, together with the author's responses. You can then publish revised versions of your articles for re-review on VeriXiv until it's finally approved for publication. All versions as part of that process will be archived, linked, and citable on VeriXiv. So again, it's an open and transparent process. Then finally, once your preprint's passed peer review, it will be published as the final version of record article on Gates Open Research as our first partner platform. Over time, VeriXiv may also be linked into other publication venues, and you'll have the option to publish your peer-reviewed manuscript in your chosen venue, hence the kind of curate component here. You can choose how to curate the final published version of record. Your article will then be indexed in the databases where that journal or platform's been included. One of the other important features of VeriXiv that I'd like to highlight here is the diversity of article types that will be supported. Initially, this will be the same as Gates Open Research. Hence, this slide is outlining the different article types available on that platform. So the intention is that VeriXiv can be used to disseminate outputs from all stages of the research life cycle, not just research articles or findings. So this could include material from the concept formation part of your research, an initial review, for example. Then at the planning stage, you might want to publish a study protocol or a methods paper or some initial findings as a research note. Then as you get to data collection and you build up a data set, you can publish a data note once that data has been deposited in a repository, or a software tool article describing software that's been designed and built in the course of your research. And then obviously at the analysis stage, you could publish your final research findings. Again, you could publish individual findings as research notes. So that full diversity, that full life cycle can be captured through this preprint server. So alongside the various article types VeriXiv supports, there are also a number of additional features that aren't commonly found on preprint servers that, again, I'd like to just highlight here. So, to stress, we're not just posting up PDFs. All preprints will be published according to the same production standards as a journal article. So not only the abstract, but the entire preprint will be fully typeset and tagged in XML, which will enhance discoverability and readability of the content itself. Any figures will also be embedded in the HTML version, as you can see here on the right, as individually downloadable components of your article. At the bottom of the preprint, readers will be encouraged to comment on each version, so ideally informing your revisions along with the peer review comments if you opt to engage with peer review. Your preprint will also include metric tracking, so encompassing views, downloads, citations, and we'll have some helpful graphs as well, as you can see on the right. So you can see, say, the geographical spread of views and downloads for your article. So as I said before, one of the defining features of VeriXiv is the emphasis on pre-publication ethics and integrity checks and badging for those checks. I'm going to come on to that very briefly, shortly, sorry. But before then, I'd like to see if I could bring up another poll. So yeah, in this poll, I wondered what kind of checks do you think are typically carried out on preprints before they're published or posted on the preprint servers? And there's some examples there of the types of preprint server that you may have engaged with in the past. So again, it looks like we're getting quite a healthy mix of answers, actually. And so most of you for now think that there will be some similarity and some kind of some similarity checks and some ethical checks will be carried out. And then about 27% of you think that same as journal article submission, so the same level of checking. And then, yeah, about 20% saying none at all. 18% saying just similarity checking only, so checking for things like plagiarism, and I should be able to share the results of that. So we just have one or two coming through. So yeah, you should be able to see the results now, that poll. So yeah, interesting, and yeah, no, not a huge amount of common agreement here about what level of but detect maybe some uncertainty about the level of checking that's carried out. So I'm going to go back to my presentation. And we'll come back to that. I mean, to give you a preview of the answer, I suppose, It varies really quite a lot in terms of the level of checking that's carried out. Usually some level of checks will be carried out on preprints on a whole host of preprint servers, which we'll see later. But what we're trying to do with VeriXiv is to do more than some of the basic checks. And we're going to look at the differences as we come onto that later. So to talk now about the checks themselves and the kind of badging that we're proposing for the platform. So here you can see on the right, 3 categories of check that will be carried out on all manuscripts that are submitted to VeriXiv. And so yeah, all the checks that are carried out, I said there'll be around 20, will be grouped into different categories. And to be published on VeriXiv, all preprints must pass our authorship, publishing ethics, and research integrity checks, which themselves capture over 20 individual checks, which we'll see later. If the preprint passes those mandatory checks, it will be badged accordingly with 3 badges and published as a verified preprint. Just to say, the badges at this stage are indicative, they're not final designs, and they won't be live on the platform from day 1, but will be introduced in the months following launch once the platform's up and running. So for authorship, let's look at a bit more detail about what these checks involve. So to receive the authorship icon or badge, your preprint will have passed the following checks. So your identity will have been confirmed through your ORCID ID. All authors will have been asked to provide an author contribution statement, ideally in the kind of credit format. And we can come back to that at the end if you'd like to ask more about that. Authors will have confirmed that they've got the right to publish. All metadata will have been checked and matched as well, that's been provided, including things like grant IDs. They will have been checked and verified to ensure that you're eligible to publish on VeriXiv, as this will be limited only to Gates grantees to begin with. And authors will have disclosed any competing interests as well as part of that submission. To receive the ethical badge, the paper will have passed these checks here. So if the clinical trial ID was required, we'll check that it was present if one is required for that kind of submission. We'll check to see if any third-party permissions have been sought for any content that's been reused. We'll check that you have a consent statement for any human participants that were involved in the research. We'll see if the article requires a public harm assessment, and if so, whether it's received one, and whether that was required. If ethical oversight was required, we'll check if one is present, so details of the ethics board approval for the research. And we'll check if the authors have removed any identifying information from their manuscript, again, if it involved human participants. Then to receive the integrity badge, the paper will have passed these checks here. So completion of a content similarity check. So as you might guess, checking for plagiarism or unintentional, overlaps between your manuscript and say something else that you've published elsewhere or another manuscript. We'll be checking that language is inclusive, the content's intelligible, that we can make sense of it, and that it's scholarly, and really that it suits the kind of article type that you've submitted, so that it is a scholarly output, an output from your research. It's not, for example, like a blog article or something. It's more editorial in nature. There'll be a completion of an image manipulation check and also an image regulation check. And the difference there is for the image regulation, we're checking on the images, do they have any harmful content or content that otherwise will be some problems publishing and sharing, say from a kind of legal or ethics standpoint. So in addition to the mandatory checks, there are also some others that articles will undergo. And these will assess whether the authors demonstrated a commitment to open research principles of transparency and reproducibility. Again, I'll come onto these in more detail shortly. But for this set of checks, there'll be 2 badges. So there'll be one on the left that will indicate an article has both been checked according to these criteria and has passed these checks. And there will also be a grayed out version to indicate that an article has been checked, but it hasn't passed. Either way, the article will still be published. So unlike the verified checks that we saw earlier, it's not a requirement for authors to pass these checks for it to be published, but all manuscripts will undergo these checks. So again, to receive the badge for this set of checks, we'll be looking to see if any underlying data is open and available, if any software and code is also open and available, whether the software that was used was open source, whether you've abided by any reporting guidelines for the article type that you've submitted, for example, the Prisma reporting guidelines for reviews, and whether the methods are kind of clearly stated in reproducibility on their own terms. So yeah, here's a kind of summary of the checks that I've described. The eagle-eyed among you will notice that there aren't 20 listed here. That's because some of the checks we're not giving the details of, so that authors can't and kind of bad actors can't sidestep those checks. So it's deemed kind of necessary to withhold some of the information of some of the checking that will be carried out to avoid people from sidestepping or finding ways around them. Okay, and then on this slide, just to give you a breakdown, and again, essentially to answer the poll question. So yes, if you answered that, some checks are carried out, including similarity and some ethics checks, that is broadly the case, particularly for some of the well-known preprint servers. So what we're doing differently here is, I guess, some more nuance and some deeper investigation into the content of the article itself. So and also some of the information that's been submitted as part of that. So things like looking at author validity, computing interests, the grant information, permissions, consent requirements, language, whether the language is inclusive, looking at the author contributions, whether they're clearly stated, image manipulation, that kind of additional checking isn't always offered, and then also these open research checks, so the not mandatory but optional additional checks, looking at reporting guidelines, reproducibility, and how data and software have been handled in the manuscript as well. So to summarize, really on this slide, just to give you a kind of full overview of the benefits of engaging with this platform as a Gates grantee, some of which apply to preprints in general, really. It allows you to get research out there quickly, pre-peer review, allows the research community to build on and cite it earlier in the process. Doing that will allow you to establish priority ahead of others working in related areas. You can improve your research by getting feedback before peer review on this platform, and the commenting function there will be very helpful in that respect. You can demonstrate evidence of productivity and research output for institutional performance reviews, grant funding, and so on. And it avoids duplication of research in your field as well by informing the community of ongoing and planned research, particularly for those article types earlier in the process, like a study protocol, for example. So while VeriXiv allows you to get your outputs out there quickly, you can also demonstrate the rigor and the quality of your work through the pre-publication checks and those public badges that we'll be providing as part of the platform. It's going to be an open and iterative process, so allowing you to publish linked revisions as you continue to build on your work, as you receive more comments and reviews, and showcase how your research has developed over time. Like I said before, the production standards will be on par with the journal, so fully typeset, tagged in XML. And really the process of publishing via VeriXiv will prepare you and your manuscript for its final destination. So having undergone the checks and passed the requirements, your manuscript will be journal ready by that point. You will save time that you'll have to spend further down the line to prepare your manuscript for publication. And you will have already had some pointers and some feedback about how to get it to its final destination. So thank you. I think that's everything from my presentation. Just to flag, obviously, the platform will be launched next month. There's a link here if you want to sign up to find out more information about it. Before we go to the Q&A, which will start in a moment, I'd just like to put up one last poll. Cannot do that now. So now having had a full description of what the VeriXiv model will involve, curious to know if you'd be interested in submitting your research to VeriXiv. And the answer coming through. Um, so far, most of you say yes. Then about 38% say maybe.
It's a healthy amount of skepticism. I like it.
There's a degree of skepticism. Yeah, that's fine. And we can answer any questions, obviously, in the Q&A you might have about the model. And then we've got 6 saying no at this stage. So I'll just give it a couple more seconds, but I think we've hit the plateau at 86 responses, which is great. And I'll just end that and share it. So that's great. Okay, so we're now going to hand over to a Q&A. So as Kat mentioned, please continue to post your questions in the Q&A box.
Yes. We have a lot of great questions. So George, okay, I think I will start with more of the policy related questions, if that's okay. And we will aim to get through as many as possible. There's some overlap as well. So yeah, thank you so much for participating and asking these great questions. To reiterate, yeah, so we will not have a central fund, nor will grant funding be able to be used for APCs beginning in 2025. We will support manuscripts that are submitted, so they don't have to be accepted, just submitted before the end of this year, 2024. Let's see. Submission to VeriXiv is not a requirement. It is one of many options. But one that we hope will really benefit our grantee authors to leverage. It is open only to grantees at this time. Let's see. Oh, good question. And so VeriXiv is not meant to compete with the other preprint servers. We wanted to have an option out of many. I think some of the benefits from the Gates Foundation perspective is leveraging the technology and platform of Gates Open Research that we've already had and have been using since 2016. It's integrated with our grants management system, so we're able to verify and connect the articles back to the original research grant, which is, I think, really important and oddly very hard to do in this space, is to verify funding metadata and have that be accurate. And we also have a very broad range of disciplinary and article types that we want to be able to support, and not all preprint servers allow for that at this time. So, and I think it's I'm really excited and interested too in the kind of checks and seeing and experimenting what we can do with that, as I think it's very important as we see how models will change and shift over the years. Okay, I think that answers most of those questions there. And now I'm going to open the Q&A box. Okay, so there's, and George, I'm curious to get your opinion on this, but this has come up from the policy perspective as well, that there might be journals that do not accept preprints and consider those prior publication. As far as I'm aware, there may be very, very few journals. I know that often at times their own checks and systems can catch that as a prior publication, but often once that's clarified with the editor, it's not an issue. So from our perspective, a majority of where our grantees publish should accept preprints.
Yeah, I'd fully support that answer, and also in addition, on VeriXiv, it's going to be very clearly flagged and badged actually that the articles haven't been peer reviewed, that they're not peer reviewed version of record publications, and in addition to these checks and the other badging, it's trying to make it very, very clear, both for subsequent publications, journals, but also for the wider research community and people who might engage with that preprint research. This isn't peer reviewed yet. And yeah, if authors, prospective authors, are coming across these constraints from journals, we'd be very keen to know, particularly the types of journals that we'd expect authors to go on to publish in. But it's not a constraint that we've come up against very much in terms of mainstream academic journals.
Great, thank you. And this is a really great comment about our decision to stop supporting APCs and viewing that as more equitable. And I think this is really a complicated topic and a complicated situation to try and address and fix. And so our perspective on this is, if we continue to support these fees, there's been very little success in, I think, pushing back, driving prices down, or at least stopping them from continuing to rise year over year. We have a lot of unfunded authors. We get requests every single day to support those APCs. And so the idea is that, in order to shift towards supporting more equitable models, that we have to stop supporting the APC model. I also think that then that opens it up for, I'd love to see publishers much more involved, that if open access and equity is important to publishers, that we have more and equitable options than relying on APCs. Otherwise, we worry that it's kind of becomes a blank check from funders to cover these costs. And of course, when we talk about equity, like open access policy can only solve for so much. There needs to be much more done in I think, a broader context around equity within research, how we're funded. I think it's a very good point that wealthier institutions will be able to continue to pay. But I think something has to shift in the system for us to be able to find what is more equitable.
Just to pick up on this point here from
Yeah.
Sydney about preventing preprints essentially being misused and guiding policy and so on. Again, I think as we, I suppose, try to illustrate in this presentation, there's going to be an enormous amount of quite detailed checking that will go on before a preprint makes it out into the open, particularly in terms of ethics and integrity, which ought to pick up some of the kind of common concerns on the ethics and integrity side. There will be an opportunity for academic dialogue with that preprint once it's available. Again, it's going to be very clearly badged as not peer-reviewed when it's at that stage, and as authors go on to have their preprint reviewed on VeriXiv, and we support that as well. We do encourage, authors to go on to have their preprint reviewed and to revise that preprint according to the comments that come through and improve that academic output. But yeah, so there'll be plenty of, as I say, checks and balances to catch some of those concerns, but also to say that if any significant concerns are raised in relation to preprints that are available on the platform, we're still going to be operating in adherence to all the guidelines set by Committee on Publication Ethics, according to covering retractions and statements of concern and so on. So again, it's about raising that standard really of publication practice and also legitimacy for those for preprints, whilst also encouraging subsequent peer review.
Great. And looking at a couple other questions, again, want to reiterate that this is not required or mandated to publish on VeriXiv. It is an option, and you are definitely allowed to submit to any other journal. So it's very similar to any other preprint server. There's no list of journals that are allowed. I think since there's so many of them, that'd be kind of impossible to have. Yeah, so it shouldn't impact the journal that you finally submit in. I should say, we do cover all of the publishing costs for VeriXiv in both Gates Open Research, and we will continue to do that. So when we talk about, the business model, that is covered by the foundation, and we're aiming to try to have it be more of the inclusive model of both kind of sides of the platform. So trying to, again, get away from that, looking at a per article charge there.
In terms of the projected timeline for review for VeriXiv preprints, yeah, so we can't give a turnaround time as yet, really, whilst the platforms are still in development. We expect the pre-publication turnaround times to be, equivalent on a par, really, with other preprint servers, whilst also, there will be a little bit of extra time to carry out some of the checks, but we think it's worthwhile. And we're not expecting there to be kind of significant lags versus other preprint servers in terms of that turnaround time pre-publication. But at the same time, it's a balancing act. We want to make sure that content is dependable and has passed all of these checks that we require that are addressing some of the other concerns that are coming through actually in this Q&A. And then in terms of indexing in PubMed, so if preprints go on to be peer-reviewed and then published in a version of record outlet like Gates Open Research, then they will be indexed in the services provided there. The pre-review preprint will be indexed in Google Scholar automatically, and that's the only index so far for the pre-review version. But that's just from launch, and we can look at developing that further as we get to launch.
Yeah, it's something we are definitely interested in having, but that'll, I think, take time. Okay, reading through some more questions. Thank you for all these great questions. Keep them coming. There's a good question about the process for revision, a couple around revisions, because that's one of the things that I think is fantastic about Gates Open Research is it has full versioning control, so things can be changed and adapted as needed. George, will that be similar for VeriXiv?
In terms of that versioning process, yeah, so can't see the question myself, but yeah, that process is going to be the same, really.
Okay, great.
The peer review will be conducted on VeriXiv rather than on Gates Open Research. If authors opt to, as I say, engage with peer review with the intention of publishing on Gates Open Research, and that's because obviously over time there might be other publication venues that manuscripts can be sent to post peer review. But that peer review will take place on VeriXiv. The versioning process will happen on VeriXiv. So post launch of VeriXiv on Gates Open Research, the content that's published there will be the final kind of approved version that's past peer review. But all of the versions will be linked together, and you'll be able to see that evolution of the manuscript in a transparent way in exactly the same way that you can on Gates Open Research currently.
Here's a great question. How does VeriXiv handle large authoring groups or study groups for preprints?
Again, this is going to be handled in much the same way as we do for Gates Open Research. And as I mentioned before, we'll be conducting checks as part of the submission process to ensure that author contributions have been clearly stated. So for large authoring groups, as before, you'll have a corresponding author. That might not necessarily be the lead author or the lead contributor. It can handle multi-authored, like large multi-authored submissions that so long as those kind of contributions are clearly outlined and stated using the kind of credit taxonomy. And that credit taxonomy has really been set up with the intention of handling those sorts of projects where there are lots of people involved and they will have various roles. And that's not just necessarily writing. That could be data collection. It could be developing software. It could be a whole host of roles in that project, really. And obviously we'd have to have the basic metadata that we need for each of the authors, so we can verify their identity and so that they can approve that their contribution is correct. So like for any submission to a journal, all the co-authors would be asked to approve the submission that's been sent to VeriXiv. So it's again, it's comparable to what you would have seen with a lot of academic journals and also with Gates Open Research.
Great. And there's a question, can VeriXiv be used as a data repository? No, and neither is Gates Open Research a data repository itself, but definitely one of the things I appreciate most about Gates Open Research is the care and attention that's been paid to making sure that the underlying data is linked to and made available through other repositories.
Yeah, so there's the data note article type, which again can be used for VeriXiv as well as Gates Open Research. That will, if you want to really report specifically on data that has been posted in a repository, we fully support that. And as Ashley said, yeah, that we'll have some guidance on the kind of repositories that data can be deposited in, but VeriXiv is going to be a place for manuscripts to be published.
Great. And then there's a few questions around kind of the pipeline to then submitting to other journals. Um, I think that that's a great call out. It's something we have discussed, especially wanting to avoid double work, I think is a really important call out. And I know some preprint servers and publishers like PLOS like it really aim to make that easier. So I think that that could be something that's on the timeline. And I know, George, you can speak more to, the pipeline to Gates Open Research and then other Taylor and Francis journals as well.
Yeah, yeah. So this is the kind of the longer term view for the platform, that it will be a kind of a nexus, kind of meeting point for other publication venues post peer review. Currently, as I say, we're sticking with Gates Open Research as the final destination of choice if you want to go down to follow the full end-to-end process. But also, as I say, when you've posted your preprint at the very first part of that process, you will have undergone a whole host of checking, and you will have produced a manuscript that is much closer to the standard that would be expected for submitting to another journal for peer review and publication. But over time, we intend to get to that place where you can have your peer review conducted on VeriXiv, and once approved, you'll have your approved peer review reports that you can also take to your final journal of choice. That could be linked in a perhaps more seamless way to some of the publication venues that will be directly linked to VeriXiv, or potentially it could be a package of materials that you take to other publications as well. But for the time being, it will be Gates Open Research is that endpoint that you can optionally direct your manuscript to.
Yeah, and I wanted that's a great point. And another question, really want to reiterate and clarify that the requirement is not to make the version of record open access. So that submission does not have to go to only an open access CC by journal. So the version of record can end up behind a paywall. We know a majority of our grantees do publish in hybrid journals, and since we're ending APC support, and then also the transformative journal program from the Coalition S is ending this year, is one of the other motivations that we had for having a preprint fulfill our policy requirements. So we'd have just a few moments left in the hour. I think, George, it'd be good if you could cover just a couple questions of when the system will be available for submissions. And then I think it would be great if we can be able to answer any of the questions we didn't get to later. And I'm not sure the best process for that, but very, very much appreciate that there are still a lot of questions
Yeah.
open, which is great. Appreciate that, but I want to make sure we can get them answered.
Absolutely. So the VeriXiv platform will be available for submission at the beginning, early part of August. If you've signed up to our other webinars, or if you haven't, I should say, I'd encourage you to do that, because we have another coming on the 22nd of July, and then another on the 8th of August. On the 8th of August, we'll be demonstrating how you go about practically submitting to the platform. So that will be an option available to you at that point. So yeah, do have a look out for those webinars. If you've ticked to say that you're happy for us to contact you after this one, we'll happily send around answers to the questions that have been missed, which have been recorded here, perhaps kind of collected under common themes. And we'll also share with you details of those forthcoming webinars. And if you'd be happy to have an interest in having a conversation with us as well about submitting your work to VeriXiv once it's ready, or just to have a general conversation about what that process might look like, I'll be very happy to speak to anyone who's interested in having that kind of conversation too. So my contact details are given there, and you can follow up with me as well when we get in touch about the unanswered questions. But yes, we will send around some further answers along with a recording as well of the webinar, which you can watch again at your own leisure, or share if you'd like to do that as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much. Kat, do we have everything we need for follow-up questions?
Yep, I believe we do.
Awesome.
Brilliant. So an email will go out to everyone tomorrow, hopefully, with a link to access the recording to this webinar, for this webinar. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Everyone have a great rest of your day.